One of the major challenges also at this point is the food crisis. And what can also European countries do to help resolve this crisis?
Yeah. Well, as I think I mentioned earlier, the programs of the IMF and World Bank undermined agriculture in many African countries because they forbid African governments to give subsidies and support and marketing facilities to small producers. And they also undermined local production through forcing open these economies. At the same time, the IMF and World Bank said to small producers and big producers in these countries, look, don't try and produce food yourselves, because the United States and Europe can produce food much more cheaply than you can, you know. They even encouraged or pressurized governments in SADC to sell off their food stocks, you know. Zimbabwe had been given responsibility by the whole of SADC to be the food security country on behalf of the whole of SADC. And the IMF and World Bank encouraged them to sell off their food stocks and rely on the cheaper products from the international market. Well, of course, within 2 years, we had a major drought in southern Africa, and we had to buy food on the international market, and the prices had soared. And that is our problem now, is that we no longer produce our own food. We buy on the international market, and we are subject to the vagaries of international prices and speculation by international commodity traders. And we are now in a very vulnerable position. Instead of having food security and food sovereignty, we are very much exposed to market forces from the global economy. Plus, the double irony is that we now depend on food aid from the United States, which uses food aid to dump its excess production in our economies. And that further undermines local production. It also introduces GMOs into our countries, which many don't want. And we are now in a very vulnerable position, okay, because of the rising food prices. As the United States is encouraging maize farmers to produce agri-fuels, maize is becoming more and more expensive for our people, and we have got a major food crisis. There's another dimension to the agricultural crisis in our area, is that the IMF and World Bank said to our small farmers, don't produce food, produce valuable cash crops, you know, produce flowers for the Europeans and produce some luxurious vegetables like mange tout and mushrooms, and produce fruit and so on, and fruit for the Europeans. Well, it's very nice for the Europeans. They get very nice, cheap food from Africa, while the people in Africa are starving. Okay. And the further effect of this is that they give the same advice to many countries simultaneously. So these countries are competing with each other. There's now horticultural exports from many African countries, and they are competing with each other, and the prices go down. So who benefits? Europeans get nice, cheap, wonderful flowers and fruit and vegetables from Africa. And, that is now the crisis. And we say we've got to restructure and redirect our production and our trade. And the prime purpose of agricultural production is food, family food security, and national food sovereignty. And national food sovereignty not only means that we have enough food within our country to have food security, but food sovereignty means we have the right to decide what we produce and how we produce, and whether we want to subsidize our farmers or not. And at present, the IMF and World Bank and the WTO actually put enormous pressures on our governments not to subsidize our small farmers, while of course they are very permissive to the Europeans and the United States to negotiate how and when and whether they're going to reduce their subsidies. On the question of subsidies, it's not for us to decide what is right for the Europeans. And if the Europeans want to subsidize their farmers, that is a question for them to discuss. It's a heavy burden on European citizens to subsidize a very small number of agribusinesses, as far as we know. The great majority of the cap goes to big agribusinesses. But anyway, that's not our right to decide or debate. But what is our right to debate is that this internal policy of the European Union has international repercussions, and that is on us. And therefore we must have the right to protect our small farmers and to protect our economies against this very powerful economy and exports from the European Union.